To think that my once steady and secure hands would tremble at the memory of gunfire and the sound of desperate screams. My name is Alejandro, and I was a soldier in a conflict that history may forget, but whose scars still mark my skin and soul. This illness is not just a metaphor in history books or the speeches of old generals. It is a real, penetrating, and voracious disease that consumes from within. It starts with a tremor in the hands, a stirring in the chest, an urgency in the mind. Then it takes over you completely, dominating every thought, every action, every beat of your heart. My story began in the quiet city of Rosario, where I grew up surrounded by the gentle murmurs of the Paraná River and the vibrant colors of blooming jacarandas. My childhood passed between games on the cobblestone streets and hot afternoons when my mother, with her floral apron, prepared empanadas that filled the house with an aroma of happiness and simplicity. But that tranquility faded the day the army arrived in the city, looking for young men willing, or rather forced, to join a cause that few understood and many feared. At just 18 years old and with a heart full of uncertainty, I was forced to leave behind my home, my family, my dreams. The training was brutal, an endless series of days and nights where the only goal was to strip us of our individuality, molding us into soldiers, into war machines. They taught us to shoot, to obey without question, to harden our hearts against compassion and remorse. And then, without warning, we found ourselves on the battlefield, a desolate terrain where the very earth seemed to scream in pain. Days blended into nights, and the cold metal of the weapon became an extension of my own body. The fever had infected me, and every shot, every scream, every fallen comrade only fueled this disease, this burning that consumed all reason, all fear, all humanity. But amidst that madness there was a moment of clarity, and the fog of war lifted before my eyes. It was during a reconnaissance mission under the threatening darkness of the night when I saw an enemy, a young man not much older than me, with eyes full of fear and desperation. In that instant our gazes crossed, and something inside me broke. It was like looking in a mirror, seeing reflected not only his face but also my own fear, my own uncertainty. In an impulsive act I lowered my weapon, and with a silent gesture urged him to flee. I don't know if it was bravery or madness, but at that moment I chose to see the man before the enemy. I returned to camp that night with a storm of emotions inside me. I didn't speak of what had happened, but I knew something in me had changed irrevocably. The fever still burned, but now it was mixed with doubts and questions that dared not be voiced aloud. The following weeks were a whirlwind of combat and tactical movements. I saw friends fall, boys from my neighborhood with dreams and hopes that would never be fulfilled. Each night when I closed my eyes, the faces of those young men haunted me, and the fever turned into remorse and pain. Then came the news that we would be sent on a major assault, a mission that was promised to be decisive. The night before leaving, while everyone was preparing, I escaped. I could not bear it anymore. I could not be part of that death machine for another second. I wandered aimlessly, moving as far away as I could from the battlefield until dawn found me exhausted and lost. I took refuge in a small, abandoned village where only the echoes of the clashes could be heard. It was there that she found me, Maria, a young woman from the village who had decided to stay to care for her sick grandmother. At first, she looked at me with distrust and fear, but something in her gaze told me she saw beyond the uniform, beyond the soldier. But in the end, they gave me refuge despite the danger it represented. With them, I found a piece of humanity I thought lost. In the weeks that followed, I helped in whatever way I could, momentarily forgetting the war, the fever that still burned inside me. But war has a way of catching up with you no matter how far you run. One afternoon, while collecting provisions in the forest, I heard the sound of engines and voices. It was an enemy patrol, and I knew I had to return and warn the girls who had helped me. I ran like never before, driven by a fear and determination I did not know I possessed. When I arrived, I explained the situation and urged them to flee. Maria, with tears in her eyes, refused to leave her grandmother, who was too weak to move. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. I stayed with them, promising to protect them with my life if necessary. The patrol arrived shortly after, and what followed was a whirlwind of screams, gunfire, and chaos. The confrontation was brief but intense. I managed to neutralize the patrol, but not without consequences. A bullet grazed my shoulder, leaving a burning trail of pain. For the moment, the girls were safe, but I knew more soldiers would come. We had to move. With Maria's help, I managed to bandage my wound. The grandmother, with a look full of gratitude and sadness, urged us to leave without her. But Maria refused. She would not leave her grandmother behind. We decided to hide in the basement of the house, hoping the patrol would pass by. Those moments in the basement were eternal. The sound of boots above, the voices searching, the fear of being discovered. Maria clung to my hand. Her grip was both of fear and comfort. In her eyes, I saw reflected all the horrors and losses that war brings. When the sound of boots receded, we waited for hours before daring to come out. The house was silent, a silence heavier than the roar of battle. We decided to leave at dawn, carrying the grandmother on an improvised stretcher. Our journey was slow and dangerous, avoiding patrols and seeking refuge wherever we could. In the days that followed, my relationship with Maria grew stronger. In her, I found a bravery and determination that inspired me. In her stories, in her laughter, I saw glimpses of the life I had left behind, a life that now seemed like a distant dream. But war always has the last word. One night, while we were resting in an abandoned barn, we were surprised by an enemy patrol. We had no time to react. They captured me, leaving Maria and her grandmother behind, promising not to harm them if they cooperated. They took me back to the front, where I was judged for desertion. The sentence was predictable. I would be executed at dawn. I spent the night in a dark cell, thinking of Maria, her grandmother, my family, everything the war had taken from me. Dawn came with a cold and ruthless light. They took me to the execution site where a firing squad awaited. I closed my eyes, preparing for the end. But the shot never came. Instead, I heard screams and confusion. I opened my eyes to see a group of rebel soldiers attacking my captors. In the confusion, I managed to escape, running without looking back, driven by fear and hope. My escape took me back through a war-torn landscape. In my mind, there was only one goal: to find the girls, to ensure they were safe. The pain from my wound was a stark reminder of my reality, but also kept me focused, kept me moving. After days of relentless searching, I arrived at the place where I had left them. My heart sank when I found the barn burned to the ground. Fearing the worst, I frantically searched through the rubble until, miraculously, I found a note hidden under a stone. It was from Maria, saying they had managed to escape and were heading to a nearby village known for helping war refugees. With renewed hope, I headed for that village. The journey was long and dangerous, but the possibility of reuniting with them gave me strength. Upon arrival, after hours of searching, I found them. Maria and her grandmother were alive, though exhausted and scared. The reunion was a moment of pure joy, a brief respite amid the chaos. We decided to stay in the village, which had become a refuge for those fleeing the war. There, among others who shared similar stories, we found a semblance of peace. The three of us worked together to help others, to rebuild something of what the war had taken from us. But even in that relative peace, the war remained present. I spent sleepless nights tormented by memories, by the guilt of those I couldn't save, by the anger towards those who had caused so much pain. In time, the war came to an end. Treaties were signed, weapons silenced, but for many of us, the internal battle continued. We decided to leave the country, seeking a new beginning in a place far from the memories and scars of the conflict. We found a small town in a distant country where jacarandas bloomed with the same beauty as my childhood. There we began a new life, a life marked by war, but also by hope and love. Looking back, I realized the fever never really left me. It still burns in some corner of my being, a reminder of what I lived through, what I lost, what I survived. But it also taught me the value of life, the power of forgiveness, and the strength of human love. I am Alejandro, and this is my story, one among many about the fever of war. Here I am, looking at the vast night sky full of stars that seem to witness my deepest thoughts. My name is Martin Gomez, Sergeant of the Argentine Army, and this is my story. It was a cold night. I don't remember exactly when, between March and June, when it all began. I was stationed at a remote barracks in Patagonia, a place where many ancient legends are heard, and the landscapes leave you with a feeling that something evil is lurking. But that night, my breath was taken away for a very different reason. "Martin, do you have a moment?" said Captain Rodriguez, pulling me out of my thoughts. He was a middle-aged man with a commanding presence and a posture that spoke of years in service. "Of course, sir," I replied, following him to his office. Once inside, he closed the door, and his expression turned serious. "What I'm about to tell you must not leave these four walls," he began, and I knew immediately that this was no ordinary conversation. I nodded, feeling a knot in my stomach. "We have received confidential information. There are rumors of a covert operation involving not only the Army but also high-profile civilians. I need you to be part of a special team to investigate this." My eyes widened. "A covert operation, sir? Of what kind?" "We don't know yet, and that's your mission. To find out what's going on, who's involved, and what their objectives are." Although my mind was flooded with questions, how could I, a simple sergeant, unravel a mystery of such magnitude? "You'll start tomorrow. You'll be transferred to Buenos Aires under a false identity. There, Agent Mendoza will contact you and guide you in the next steps." I left the captain's office with a weight on my shoulders. I didn't know that conversation would change my life forever. The next day, with a backpack over my shoulder and a plane ticket in hand, I found myself at Buenos Aires Airport. The city, with its vibrant energy and noisy streets, was a world completely different from the quiet and orderly barracks I was used to. I followed the instructions to the letter, arriving at a small apartment in the Palermo neighborhood that would serve as my base of operations. That night, while the city's hustle and bustle resonated outside, my phone rang. "Gomez?" a deep and direct voice asked from the other side. "I'm Mendoza. We'll meet tomorrow at 8 at La Poesia Cafe. Don't be late." I hung up, feeling a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Who was this agent Mendoza, and what did he know about the covert operation? The next day, I entered the cafe, a cozy place full of bookshelves and wooden tables. A man in his 40s with dark hair and a carefully trimmed beard greeted me with a gesture. It was Mendoza, without a doubt. "Martin, sit down. Let's get straight to the point," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "The operation we're investigating seems to be related to illegal arms trafficking. There are indications that high-ranking Army officers, as well as politicians and businessmen, are involved." My mind was spinning. Arms trafficking, officers involved. It was more serious than I had imagined. "Your role will be to infiltrate certain military and political circles. We need to gather information, anything that can help us understand the magnitude of this operation." I nodded, although the idea of infiltrating those circles seemed almost impossible. "And how am I supposed to do that?" Mendoza smiled slightly. "You have skills that others don't. You're smart, observant, and, most importantly, no one knows you here. That gives you an advantage." We spent the next few hours discussing the details of the plan. Mendoza had connections at various levels of the government and the Army, and had designed a false identity for me, Marcelo Fernandez, a young entrepreneur interested in defense contracts. As I left the cafe, I felt a heavy responsibility on my shoulders. Not only did I have to protect my true identity, but I also had to delve into a dangerous and unknown world. The following days were spent immersing myself in my new identity. Marcelo Fernandez was a complex character. I had to be convincing, a businessman with enough knowledge about defense and armament not to raise suspicions. Mendoza provided me with forged documents and a detailed background story. I studied every detail, every date, every fictitious event of Marcelo's life as if it were my own story. My first task was to attend a gala event where several high-ranking officers and influential politicians would gather. It would be the perfect opportunity to start establishing contacts and gathering information. On the night of the event, dressed in an elegant suit and feigned confidence, I mingled with the guests. The room was full of lively conversations, laughter, and the sound of clinking wine glasses. I approached the bar, ordering a drink while discreetly observing the crowd. "Is this your first time at one of these events?" The voice came from a woman beside me. She was tall, with brown hair and eyes that reflected intelligence and curiosity. "Yes, it is, actually. I'm Marcelo Fernandez," I replied, extending my hand. Lucia Ramirez, she said, shaking my hand. Her grip was firm, confident. I work at the Ministry of Defense. The conversation flowed naturally. She was insightful, and soon I found myself talking more than I had planned. However, I maintained my character's facade, sharing anecdotes and false information I had prepared. As we talked, a man approached. Lucia introduced him as Colonel Torres, a high-ranking army officer. The colonel had an imposing presence and a gaze that seemed to see right through you. "Nice to meet you, Marcelo. I've heard you're interested in the defense business," Torres said, studying me with an evaluative look. "That's right, Colonel. I believe there's a lot of potential in the sector," I responded, trying to sound as convincing as possible. Torres nodded, but his eyes continued to analyze me. I felt a hint of fear, wondering if he had seen something in me that betrayed my true identity. The night continued, and I managed to establish several useful contacts. However, the feeling of being watched by the colonel never left me. Upon returning to the apartment, I sat in the dark, reflecting on the night. I had accomplished what I came to do, but something in the colonel's gaze unsettled me. What did he really know? And what secrets lay beneath the surface of these meetings? The following days, I delved even deeper into Marcelo's world. I attended meetings, dinners, and events, always with my ears and eyes wide open, looking for any clues that might lead me to the heart of the arms trafficking operation. Lucia became a constant presence, an ally in a world of shadows and half-truths. But it was the colonel who occupied my thoughts. His inquisitive gaze and imposing presence made me question every move. One afternoon, while I was at a cafe reviewing notes and messages, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Mendoza. "Urgent meeting, Parque Rivadavia, 20 minutes. Something in the brevity of the message told me something important had happened. I arrived at the park as quickly as possible. Mendoza was sitting on a bench, disguised with a hat and sunglasses, almost unrecognizable. "Martin, we have a problem," he said without preamble. "We've received information that someone is looking into Marcelo Fernandez. Someone is not convinced of your identity." Panic gripped me. "Who is it? What do they know?" "We're not sure, but everything points to someone within Colonel Torres's circle." "Torres?" I knew there was something about his way of looking at me. "What do we do now?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "For now, continue with the mission. But be even more careful. If you discover anything, contact me immediately." I nodded, though a voice inside me screamed that I was entering even more dangerous waters. The following weeks were filled with events and meetings. I began to gather information, names, dates, places. But the feeling of being watched never disappeared. In every corner, in every shadow, I felt the eyes of the unknown person investigating Marcelo. It was at a gala dinner where it happened. I was conversing with a group of officers when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to find myself face to face with the colonel. "Marcelo, may I have a word with you in private?" he asked, though his tone indicated it was not a question. I followed him to a secluded room where we were alone. Torres closed the door and turned to me. His expression was hard, inscrutable. "Who are you really, Marcelo?" he asked directly. "I've been investigating, and there are things about you that don't add up." I felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath my feet. This was the moment I had feared. My mind raced frantically, looking for a way out, an explanation that could satisfy the colonel without revealing my true identity. But before I could articulate a response, Torres continued. "I've done my own research, Marcelo, or should I say Martin Gomez, sergeant of the Argentine army." My heart stopped. He knew who I was. The entire espionage game, my mission, seemed to crumble before my eyes. Torres approached. His gaze now was not of suspicion, but of something deeper, almost respect. "I know why you're here, Martin, and I also know you're not the only one looking for answers about the arms trafficking operation." "What do you mean?" I asked, still in shock. "That you have allies where you least expect it," said Torres. "Not all of us are happy with what's happening in the shadows of our institution." I was stunned. The Colonel Torres, an ally? "How can I trust you?" I asked, still cautious. "For now, you have no other choice," Torres said with an ironic smile. "But you need to trust me if we're going to expose this operation." I left the dinner that night with a mix of fear and hope. Torres's revelation had changed the game completely. Now, instead of being alone in this mission, I had an unexpected ally, one with power and influence. The following days, under Torres's guidance, I delved even deeper into the investigation. With his help, I began to unravel a network of corruption and betrayal that went beyond what I had imagined. High-ranking officers, politicians, and even businessmen were involved in the illegal arms trafficking. Meanwhile, Lucia and I also teamed up. She had become a confidant, someone I could trust in this world of deceptions. Together with the information we gathered, we began to build a solid case. But with every step we took towards the truth, the danger grew. We knew we were playing a dangerous game, one that could cost us everything. It was a rainy night when it all came to a head. I received an urgent message from Torres. Meeting, Hangar 3, Old Airport, 11 p.m. It's time to act. With my heart in my throat, I headed to the place. The hangar, a large and somber building, seemed abandoned. Upon entering, I saw Torres and Lucia waiting for me. But they were not alone. Alongside them was a group of men and women, some in uniforms, others in civilian clothes. "It's time to bring the truth to light," said Torres, looking at all of us. "Tonight we dismantle the operation and expose the culprits. Are you ready?" I nodded along with the others. This was the moment of truth, the end of a long and dangerous path. But we were ready. Together, we were going to change the course of this story. The tension in the air was palpable as we prepared to take action. The hangar, with its structure worn by time, seemed to hold more secrets than we had anticipated. Torres gave us a final look, one that spoke more than 1,000 words, and we nodded. We were ready. We split into teams, each with a specific task. My team, led by Lucia, was in charge of the back of the hangar, where it was suspected the weapons were stored. Opening the metal doors, we were faced with a scene that left us breathless. Not only were there boxes of weapons, which in themselves were damning evidence, but something much more grim. At the back of the hangar, chained and in deplorable conditions, was a group of people. They were hostages, some visibly injured, others immobile. Lucia and I looked at each other, the horror reflected on our faces. We quickly began assisting the hostages, freeing them from their chains. The cries of pain and whispers of gratitude mixed into a heart-wrenching chorus. Among the hostages, we found a young man who could barely speak. With a trembling voice, he told us how they had been kidnapped and used as bargaining chips in the arms trafficking. Some, he said with tears in his eyes, did not survive the brutal treatment. Meanwhile, Torres and the other teams had secured the perimeter and detained several suspects. Among them, high-ranking officers and political figures whose faces of surprise and fear revealed their guilt. The police and emergency services arrived shortly after. As the hostages were attended to and the culprits were taken into custody, I stood watching the scene. Despite the victory, the taste was bittersweet. We had uncovered a corrupt operation and saved lives, but the cost had been high, too high. The news of the operation and the rescue of the hostages spread quickly. The arms trafficking network had been dismantled, but at an unimaginable price. The stories of the hostages, the lives lost, became a somber reminder of human cruelty and greed. In the following days, as the case unfolded in the courts and the media, I withdrew to a quiet place to reflect. I had entered this mission seeking justice, but had found much more. I found the darkness that lurks in the most unexpected corners and the light of those who fight against it. As I looked at the horizon, I knew my life would never be the same. But I also knew that despite everything, I had done the right thing, and that was something I could live with.